Hey.
Hi.
So I was thinking about how to start these Junkins journals and where we might begin. Do you remember meeting Donald Junkins, the poet, at Grandpa's 90th birthday party?
Oh yeah, yeah, definitely.
So Donald and his brother Roland were really close brothers, much the way you and Justin are. And they explored all over New England, searching for their roots. And they, in particular, had followed a lot of clues to find the location of the garrison's cellar hole, where the garrison was located in York, Maine. And as they were approaching, they sort of walked through a woodsy sort of area, and they discovered something really interesting, which really was sort of the starting point of all the Junkins Family Association discoveries and putting together the JFA, actually. So I thought maybe we'd start the Junkins Journal talking about that and explore that a little bit.
Sounds good.
Well, so you can see by the sign behind you that we're going to be talking about the Alexander Burial Ground.
I knew it. I had a feeling. That's why I created that sign.
Yeah. Well, good on you then. So in 1963, Roland and Donald had followed a number of clues to the location of the Garrison House. And one of the most interesting clues was that it was on Route 91, Cider Hill Road, and there was a big boulder on the side of the road. And if you looked at some of the paintings and illustrations of the Garrison House, you'll see this boulder. And they found it, and so they walked up the embankment from 91 into the woods there, right where the boulder was. And one of the first things they found were some headstones laying on the ground there.
Creepy.
Yeah, it was kind of interesting. I think they brushed them off, and the first thing they discovered was that the one headstone said Alexander Junkins died.
Also creepy. You're walking through the woods and you find a headstone that has your last name on it.
Yeah, well, they knew they were in Junkins territory, Junkins,
Sure, yeah.
Junkins properties, and that sort of began a whole big discovery. They found two more headstones there. They kind of left them because right nearby was the cellar hole of the Garrison House, which is what they were actually looking for. But a couple years later, or several years later, about 1984 or so, when my dad Alan had contacted them and started a sort of a research friendship with them, they met up there in York, and Roland and Donald took Alan to see what they had discovered in the woods there. And they started digging around and realized that it was a burial ground for one of the Junkinses, one of the many family burial grounds that's located all over York and that part of Maine.
So they knew they were looking for Alexander Junkins' burial ground?
They knew that, well, they were looking for the Garrison House, but then they found the burial ground that was sort of right next to the house. A lot of times when you built a house and then family members died, you made a burial ground locally rather than trudge all the way to a church to bury them. It turns out that this Alexander was not the...
So this is not the direct son of Robert Junkins.
Right. You know the names of the three sons of Robert?
I did. I do. I didn't know there was going to be a quiz today. Alexander. And Joseph. Oh man, I'm completely drawing a blank on the other one.
Daniel.
Okay, yep, of course. I knew both of those.
So the reason you remember Alexander is because we're descended from Alexander. This Alexander headstone was not the Alexander that was the son of Robert. This was 4 generations down from Robert. So Robert had a son Alexander, who had a son Alexander, who had a son Alexander, who had a son Alexander. This Alexander was born in 1785, and he died in 1844. And that's the headstone that they found there. They also found 2 other adult headstones. One was Alexander's first wife, Judith Moulton, and she died in 1817. She was the first to be buried in the burial ground that Alexander had created on his property. The second headstone was Hannah Langdon. That was his second wife, and she died in 1836. And she was the second one buried in that property. Alexander had a third wife. Her name was Hannah Bragton, and she outlived Alexander. And when Alexander died, she had him buried in this burial ground alongside of his first 2 wives.
Wow. Okay. So that, first of all, is really sad that he had, 3 wives now at this point, and that's a lot of death in your life. And then you just put them in your front yard as a reminder.
There were a lot of speculations as to why Alexander created this burial ground here, so close to his house and right on the edge of Cider Hill Road. One of the reasons speculated in the Harry Davis histories of York was that across the road was Second Parish Church, and Reverend Moody preached there. The story goes that he wanted to be up on a rise, overlooking the church, able to listen to Reverend Moody's preaching every Sunday after his death.
So I think I remember when we were up there for Grandpa's 90th, I remember standing at that graveyard, whatever that property is, almost directly across. I asked either you or Grandpa, I don't remember, and you said that was the Reverend Moody property.
Yeah, that was where the Second Parish Church stood, and Reverend Moody preached from there.
Oh, okay, that's right. You said it was the church there.
But yes, you could see that right from the burial ground, all that. So that's kind of the romantic story about why Alexander built the burial ground right on his property there. The more practical one, though, was that Cider Hill Road was becoming a major thoroughfare between Berwick and York, and he had some concerns about the road being widened and maybe taking some of his property. So the more practical view was that he built the burial ground right exactly next to the road so that the road couldn't be expanded or widened.
That's actually really cool. That's a good idea. It actually shows his sort of understanding, what the town would or could do.
Yeah.
I guess you said this was after the Revolutionary War, right? So it was America.
Yeah.
And it shows that he had some kind of understanding of sort of that if I put this here, they cannot take my property using eminent domain or.
And you've been there. You've stood in the burial ground and looked up and down 91 there, and you could tell that it was going to be a major thoroughfare. Even then, I think it was a pretty wise move.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. I actually like that. I mean, the other thing's cool too. That they wanted to hear Reverend Moody preach even in the afterlife. But I'm pretty sure ghosts and spirits can go wherever they want. They don't have to stay right where they're buried. So they could have gone right over to the church itself and probably.
So there were also found a couple of smaller unmarked headstones, and these are probably infants that died shortly after childbirth or in childbirth, and they were buried there as well.
So is Alexander buried there?
So yes, after he died, his surviving wife, Hannah Bragdon, had him buried there. Now, Hannah Bragdon is buried elsewhere in a different family burial ground. So right now, Alexander, Judith, and Hannah Langdon are buried there, along with, as I said, a couple of infant children. And when Alan and his second wife, Nancy, when their cat died, their cat just happened to be named Hannah. They buried the cat there as well.
Right. I think that fits.
One of the things that Donald and Roland and Alan really wanted to do was preserve our family's right to access the burial ground. It was on somebody else's property, and to be able to restore it and maintain it.
Did the person who owned the property at the time know that there was a burial ground there?
Yes, actually, there were a couple of different people that knew. At one point, some of the headstones had slid down the embankment into the road, and people had gathered them back up and lifted them back up into the woods there.
That's pretty cool that people, I mean, I don't know what you would do with an old headstone, like if you found it anyway, but like, it's cool that they, you know, some good Samaritan or whatever pulled it up back up into the woods instead of like leaving it in the road or, you know, throwing it away.
Or took it home and said, hey, this would make a good decoration in my yard.
Yeah.
Also, the granite posts that outlined the burial ground had been removed at some point, but yes, people knew that it was there.
Okay.
So Alan and Donald and Roland began a legal battle over the access to the property, and they contacted a number of lawyers. And over about a 15-year period, they secured warranty deed rights, which allow Junkins family members to access, restore, and maintain the burial ground.
So before that, really anybody could have done anything, or I mean, the property owner could have just gotten rid of it if they wanted to, right? We're just lucky that it stayed there that long.
In essence, if a burial ground was overgrown and you really didn't know that it was there, you could probably make it disappear. A lot of them have been identified, and there are maps. In fact, this particular burial ground is identified on a county map as burial ground number 173. There are a lot of burial grounds all over Maine, and by rights, they're not to be disturbed and touched. So you know that Alan and Betty ended up buying the property and building a house on the property. And in order to really establish what the burial ground actually would have looked like, Alan got in touch with an archaeologist named Kathleen Wheeler. And in 1990, they did an archaeological dig that identified the exact locations of the 3 adult graves and the locations of the several other infant graves. And then another dig occurred in 1991, and the outline of the burial ground and where all the fence posts made out of granite went around the cemetery. And in 1991 and 1992, a number of Junkins got together, including Roland and Donald and Alan. Cliff and Mary Jo was there. My mom Betty was there. I went up for a little bit on the restoration. A number of people went up and cleared the land of all the trees, scraped it down to the ground level, and found all the post holes. But then we needed to find the posts and get them back in place.
I'm just imagining where I was at that time.
Well, where were you?
11 and 12 years old. I do remember when Grandma and Grandpa bought the property. I remember it being a big deal. They were moving up to Maine for a really cool reason. Like, they found our ancestral property. They're like buying it. Hasn't been in our family for hundreds of years at this point. It's pretty cool.
Yeah. The mystery about the granite markers was that somebody who owned the property years before had seen the granite posts. And, you know, like you were asking, could people disturb this? Well, actually, they had taken them and dragged them up to their farm, and they used them to mark out a nice little garden. But luckily, during the restoration process, Alan and Donald went and visited and said, hey, we believe these belong to the burial ground. And they said, oh yeah, they're from there, and if you could take them away, you can have them. Granite posts that are about 6 feet tall, because about 3 feet of it went underground and 3 feet went above ground. are pretty darn heavy.
I could imagine. So you just didn't pick them up, put it over your shoulder, and walk home with it.
No. There were probably 15 or 20 of these. And so the people that were working on the restoration that weekend had rented a backhoe, and they drove up, and one at a time they put them in the scoop of the backhoe and drove them back to the burial ground. We dug holes deep, the proper depth for them, and using a tripod and a chain hoist, we lowered each one in carefully and tamped the ground back down and restored them all. And lo and behold, what was originally thought to be about a 15-foot by 15-foot burial ground, the actual burial ground was more like 15 feet by 30 or so. There is room for several other people to be buried there.
So were there more graves than they originally thought? Or was it just marked off for more dead Junkins to be put there later?
Yeah, actually the latter was it. The burial ground was just set out to be big enough to hold several more people, but none others were ever buried there in Alexander's lifetime or in the lifetime of the Garrison House.
He lost enough people, I think, in his life to bury there. So,
But other Junkins have expressed interest in wanting to be buried there. And when Tom Hodgen died, his ashes were buried there and a headstone was placed. And then later, when his wife Ruth, who is a Junkins descendant, died, her ashes were placed there. The Burkharts, their ashes both have been placed there in recent times. It's still very much a family burying ground. And as long as there's room, other Junkins can be buried there, or more importantly, their ashes can be buried there.
ashes don't take up quite as much space.
No, they don't. So that's pretty much the story of the Alexander Burial Ground. It brought together Donald and Roland and Alan, and together they formed the Junkins Family Association. They discovered lots of other burial grounds that are Junkins burial grounds in and around the York area. And it led Alan to begin a project, a record of different Junkins burying grounds, enough to make a book. We also did a burial ground marker project where we placed granite posts with brass plaques on them in about a dozen burial grounds that specifically have contact information with the Junkins Family Association.
Part of the reason we're doing this is to maybe throw some of that information out there to, hopefully there's people that are interested for generations to come that will continue to maintain those markers and those burial sites. We've got some ideas for the next few episodes.
So if you're watching this and you have questions about what the JFA is doing, what research we've done, or maybe you have a good idea for what you'd like to see in a podcast, write to us. You could link to us and send us your questions, send us your ideas.
Yeah. Any thoughts, any ideas, anything you would like to see? If you want to see Ken learn how to play bagpipes,
or if you want to see Adam in a kilt, well, then write to us and we'll do that too.